This is amazing. I don't know if I actually have room in my luggage for this hat. You might have to take it. Let's make sure these slides actually show up. Et voila, there we go. Awesome. Good afternoon. How's everyone? Super full, super awesome. Isn't this really cool? We're like all obsessive design system enthusiasts. I'm like, this is amazing to me. Because everyone here is as obsessed as I am, and I feel like I could have 100,000 awesome conversations and I wouldn't even get through everyone, which is really cool. So before I go on, please, just a huge round of applause for Gina. First time conference. I was with her when she picked the name, so it's really cool to actually see this happen. And I also find it really rad, just listening to all the talks, how closely aligned all of the speakers are, and in terms of our ideas and practices as we approach design systems. It's really neat that sort of as an industry, we are kind of seeing a path, but even though there is sort of a way, there are multiple ways, and so we still get this ethos of creativity and individuality in all of our work, which is amazing. And I was also a little bit nervous that my talk would be obsolete by this point in the day, given the amazing caliber of content, but it's not. Oh, Miriam, just looking at you for that, but thankfully you didn't take my talk. And for context, as Chris pointed out, I worked with Miriam and the Oddbirds from 2014 to about mid-2015. And it was really during my time there that I got to sort of solidify these deeper philosophies of how we work, how we build systems, and maintainable front ends. And you heard a lot about that yesterday in Miriam's talk. And so as of April of last year, I have been working at Casper. A sabbatical that I thought would be a few months has turned close to a year, but it's very interesting. And I took it as an opportunity to really apply these ideas that I was doing at scale. And so I currently lead a team of 6 to 7 front-end devs, and I work on everything from building our processes, our documentation, shaping and hiring what we're doing, really just kind of setting up front end. There wasn't anything there. So the idea for this talk, destructuring front end or a pattern language. One of the biggest constraints that I have with my team is that it was a relatively junior team. And I began to think, what if only there was some sort of manual or guideline or something that I could point them to. I would send them articles, and we have these weekly jam sessions and just trying to bring people and cultivate that knowledge and bring them up to date with what was going on. But there wasn't really anything I could point to. And my mom has started learning how to code, and she's working on her HTML website, and she'd come to me with questions, and I'd be like, oh, well, here's 5 articles in this thing, and here are another set of articles this way. And again, it was really hard to kind of explain to her the whole system of what front end is and the different pieces that make it up and how you can kind of pick and choose and put these things together. So that was the ethos for this talk, this idea of maybe developing a type of language that we could use. And so I turned to architecture. And particularly I turned to this man named Christopher Alexander, who wrote a book called Pattern Language. And he states that patterns are a collective memory of things which work really well in our surrounding. As designers and developers, our surrounding is the web and the industry of the web and the environments in which we do our work. So to me, therefore, patterns become much more than just design, HTML, CSS, and JS. They're really these set of practices that we put into place to effectively work better together. And they deal with things from processes to tools to the design systems themselves. And so a pattern language is a method of describing good design practices within a field of expertise. Since language is syntax and grammar, we can use it to compose these poetic digital spaces or beautiful web apps. So this man, Christopher Alexander, was the first person to talk about patterns, and he put together the first book, A Pattern Language. And he's an architect and an educator, but his career was extremely, extremely influential to other fields, notably programming. This is one of his earlier books that he released in the 60s, Notes on the Synthesis of Form, and it was required reading for researchers and computer science. In fact, it's actually the book that helped inspire a lot of programming language decisions, namely modular programming and object-oriented programming, can be traced back to ideas in this book. So OOCSS, less than 6 degrees away from Christopher Alexander. And so in 1977, he releases a pattern language. And one of his major goals with this book was to empower anyone to design and build at scale. And this was huge for that time period. I mean, if you wanted to build, you needed an architect. And his idea was, you don't really need an architect to build things all the time. Anyone can be empowered to do this. And this was also one of the ideas that I went into when I started working at Casper. When I thought about it, I was like, what can we do as seniors to empower and build teams? Because eventually everyone moves forward. And so even though the team starts out being relatively junior or mid-level, it can grow into a more senior team. So the book contains about 283 different patterns that he discovered and put together that are meant to create timeless buildings. And the way that you read the book is not from cover to cover. It's that you pick what you want to do, and you go read that pattern, and then from that pattern, you either jump to other patterns that it's related to or that it draws its context from. So in this way, you can kind of create this very rich web and network and decide which things you want to use. So anecdotally, I thought this was interesting because it was released in the 70s. He actually intended the book to be released in a 3-ring binder. And his idea was that you could add and remove patterns as you needed or as they became obsolete. Nowadays, I'm sure that a wonderful website with hyperlinks would suffice. But it's really cool because I think that it shows that he's thinking about something really important, and that patterns are not dogma. They can change, and they're going to adapt as the field does and as it needs to. So these things that we're saying now work really well in our current context right now, but we should be aware that this thing is a fast-moving target. So feel free to let go of these ideas as your constraints dictate. All right, so what makes up a pattern? So in a pattern language, each pattern is comprised of the following sort of metadata, if you will. Every pattern has a name, so we can identify it, perhaps the hardest part of creating the pattern. It also has context, and context tells you how and when it's used, and whenever it's possible, you can try to relate this to other patterns. The problem. What is this pattern trying to solve? What's the issue out there where you would turn to this tool? Solutions. How you can use this pattern, or how we solve the problems from this pattern. And then related patterns, which is really kind of an important part. If you're on this pattern, what other patterns might be similar? What other things can you check out? What other ideas could you use? Maybe you think you need a certain pattern only to discover that actually its related pattern would suffice. So let's try an exercise. We're going to work with the naming pattern. Our naming is hard. So the name is naming. Probably could think about something better. Our context. We need a way to identify things. And so our problem. We need to identify things so that everyone knows what we are talking about. Having a shared vocabulary that is understood by all is important and often difficult to attain. So what type of solutions do we have? You can work with all the stakeholders to establish a name. If you cannot work with everyone, just make sure that you get buy-in before you actually decide to name that thing what you called it. And then some related patterns. So, do we need a pattern language for front end? This is my question that I'm posing to you as I go through this talk. For me, this is really an idea that I've been thinking about, and I thought, well, what a perfect time here at ClarityConf. Let's share this idea with people, and people can either tell me that, yay, this is a good thing, or, you know what, stop. But here's why I think we could benefit from a pattern language. First, pattern languages are used to formalize decision-making values, whose effectiveness becomes obvious with more expertise for those of us that are like experts, but it's difficult to document and sort of pass on these decisions to novices. So if we have a pattern that shows how it works, this is something that we can share. Also, they are very effective tools in structuring our knowledge and understanding of complex systems without oversimplifying it. And web is a complex system. Front end is a complex system. There are a ton of little moving parts, a ton of little pieces that make it up, even though we might just think of it as HTML, CSS, JS, and design. So I think that having a pattern language also continuously forces us to remember that we are working in a system, and that a system is made up of a bunch of other parts and not just one thing, so that we can keep the perspective and recognize that we are but a small piece of this whole. Design systems, to me, are a part of the language, but they aren't the whole language. To me, they are really a pattern, and they describe one subset. There's a much larger system to front end. It's more than just design systems, and that's really what I'm hoping that this pattern language can aim to highlight. But I sort of leave it up to you to decide. So here we go. A pattern language for front-end web systems. And this is by no means complete. It's very much in progress. So Christopher Alexander's book divides his different patterns into about like 3 or 4 sections. And the organization of it is really just so that you can help understand and sort of create a logical grouping. But ideally, because everything can be related to everything else, how we group things is also kind of irrelevant. So take it with a grain of salt how these are organized. But here's how I see a language for front end. First, we would have our global patterns. And these are global development patterns that define the practice of front end for the web community. And what's important to note about these patterns is these can never be individually designed in one fell swoop. These patterns take a lot of time, and they often require input from people within our community and outside of it. So there are things that I'm thinking of as community guidelines. Temporary autonomous zones. That's what I call meetups and conferences. That's our opportunity to create and to come together and do so in a space that is different than the outside world, right? Independent disciplines. So these would be UI, UX, design, web guidelines from the W3C, open borders, which I'll explain, and accessibility. So these are some global patterns. Second level are what I call process patterns. And these define the philosophy of our work and how we work. So a few of the patterns would include purpose, planning and management, code reviews, cross-functional teams, single origin of truth, documentation, naming, and here is where I would put design systems, because they help inform our process. But they are, as you can see, a part of a much larger whole. Planning and management would be how we kind of scope our projects. You can put your flavor, whatever flavor of agile you want in there. The third are workspace patterns. So tier 3 and tier 4 are where we as individuals can have the most impact, because we usually make a lot of these decisions on our own. However, if you want to keep your team on the same page and make it a lot easier so to pair with folks and work with folks, I think it's really important to set sort of team standards and use the workspace patterns to set those as your team guidelines. So these include editors, what text editor you use, which is very important, your command line interface, and what are you using terminal, are you using iTerm, and beyond that, what shell interface are you using? Syntax highlighting, very, very key. Shortcuts, learning them, becoming proficient in them. Git and GitHub. General version and dependency management, how we keep things sane and keep ourselves sane, and then configuration and settings. And configuration and settings also relates to things like your editor config, and finding ways where you can store things so they can be saved and easily reused across projects. And lastly, we get into project patterns. So these are sort of the specific decisions that we make per project, whereas workspace patterns tend to be ones that we ideally make and remain over all of our different projects. So project patterns, build tools, how you're going to bundle your dependencies, how you want to organize your files, linters, composable, which to me means not having everything in sort of one directory, being able to build your project from a bunch of smaller projects. HTML templating, your CSS methodologies, JS, content strategy, shareable data, so external data files like JSON and YAML, and then identifiers. So now I'd like to show how we've been using some of these patterns. Currently, over the last few months, I've been working with our lead designer and our front-end developer to define and build Nightshade, which is our design system, and we'll be releasing that this month. But Nightshade is built on top of a new static front-end system that we call Ando. And so as a company right now at Casper, we're in the process of moving everything over to static, which is super, super exciting, and really allows us to bring more people, or to, what I would say, open up our borders and bring designers and non-technical people into our stack in a much easier way. So Ando for us is both a generator, a front-end system, front-end generator, and a system, a methodology for building interfaces. And the idea is that we bake everything into this generator so that when someone goes to start a project, they don't have to think about it. All the rules are there, and they can just quickly and enjoyably work on their features. So back to the idea of our patterns. A couple of the patterns I had, there was two, naming and purpose. And there was a reason that we went with the name Ando. And I think that, in general, purpose should be something that a pattern that we bake into all of our decisions. There should be a why. Why is something named this way? Why did we do something this way? So why did we name it Ando? Ando believes that to change the dwelling is to change the city and to reform society. Casper is a sleep and a mattress company and believes that to change your bedroom sleeping experience is going to change your life. So his style is said to create this sort of haiku effect. And I really like the idea of having this ethos sort of stick with us. The idea that as we're working in our system, our front-end system, it could change ourselves as front-end developers. It could change our team and how we work together. And also it could create sort of a restful and enjoyable process at the same time. So that was the tone that we set forth. Here are some of the patterns from before that we decided to use to form the ethos of our project. It's not all of them, but it's a handful of them. And so for the remainder of the talk, for these last few minutes, I'm going to talk about the ones that I've found incredibly helpful and have really sort of dramatically changed how I work and the quality of my work. Open borders. So the context. Working with people across different disciplines. The idea behind this name is that we want to keep these borders open. We don't want to have silos. What's the problem that this pattern is trying to solve? It's trying to provide a way for everyone to work in the same code base and contribute their skills no matter their set of expertise. So before we had Ando, we had a Ruby on Rails site, which meant that installing this on a designer's computer meant that they had to run migrations and do a bunch of other stuff and install Postgres and tons of things that that's not nice to them. That creates a lot of complexity and overhead. So what's the solution here? Ours was to use a system that had minimal dependencies. And this was really a core ethos of how we decided to pick the tools that we picked. It needed to be something that anyone could run and wouldn't be that complicated. So ours was static, no database, no migrations, back to basics. That's a photo of myself and our designer, Becky, and that's Becky working with our code base on her computer. It takes about 10, 15 minutes to get everything up and running, and once you provide them with a bit of documentation, they can easily keep it up to date and work with it, so it's been working really well. Some additional related patterns to this: cross-functional teams, the idea of people and everyone working together, and build tools. Really, build tools are kind of the backbone to this system. Let's talk about documentation. So, a way to record decisions. Pretty simple. What's the problem here? Code is not self-documenting, and we need to capture our decisions, and we make a lot of them. Furthermore, captured decisions really need to be easily referenced by people who may or may not have written the documentation in the first place. So people need to be able to find this. Some solutions: Use community-vetted code tools. Pick one place to store the documentation that is easily accessible by all members of your team and lets anyone update it. And kind of aim for the same standard across your file types so you're not reinventing the wheel every time that you work, say, in a CSS file or a JS file. So SassDoc, a wonderful tool. JSDoc is another one for your JavaScript. You can use tools like Read the Docs or a simple GitHub wiki and repo. So here are things that we're doing. This is just an example of, so the cool thing about SassDoc is that it's based on JSDoc. So it's basically the same style and the same way of documenting. So this is our SCSS, and then we can carry that over into our JS. And we actually use the same thing for our HTML macro files. And so everything is kind of documented in the same way, in the same style, which means you're not having to learn a new type of documentation for your file format. HTML templating. So like preprocessors, HTML needs a lot of love. If you're not using a templating language for your HTML, I hope that you will please start using one, and there are various out there. So we need a way to create sound structures, a way to componentize our HTML so it can be easily shared. As I mentioned, the general problem, HTML is verbose. So when we have to write a lot of it at scale, it becomes incredibly difficult to maintain. So what are our solutions? We can use a templating language, so it will give your HTML superpowers. Here's some options. There's Nunjux, Jade, and Swig. And also handlebars and mustache are common. The reason I picked these is that all of these have a very interesting feature, a macro mix-in feature, which actually lets you create reusable pieces of HTML code. And Miriam showed off a lot of that in her talk yesterday. So some related patterns. Naming also relates to this. Documentation, directory structure. So here's an example of how we're using these. Here are two components. Oop, a little too happy there. There we go. So we call this the content panel. It has an image and it has some content, and the image can be on the left or right. So we can make a macro called content panel, which is really just basically like creating a mix-in, and then we can pass in different parameters to it. So this is how it looks in practice. Whenever we want to use this content panel, instead of having to write a bunch of HTML, we call it and we pass in a title, a path to the image, an image description, what position we want, any classes or ID, and content. So it makes it really, really, really easy to see what things take. And furthermore, this type of pattern helps enforce the open borders pattern, which makes it really easy for a designer to come in and say, oh, you know, I can actually edit this myself because this makes sense. I don't have to grok through a bunch of HTML. I know that I want to change the header, or I know that I want to change the content, and I can feel comfortable doing that. Directory structure. Organizing and grouping project files. We need a way to do this, so it's easy to comprehend, and instinctively we know where things belong, and we don't have to waste a lot of time grokking around for these files. What are our solutions? There's a few. There's traditional directory structure, there's component directory structure, and there's sort of establishing naming and rules, singular versus plural. And when do files need to go in a folder? So, traditional directory structure looks like this. This is what we're pretty used to. You usually have an assets folder. In your assets folder, you have a separate folder for your CSS Sass, a separate folder for your images, a separate folder for your JS. In your views directory, you would usually divide things out based on what that page is. So your home page, and then all the templates for your home page, your product page, and vice versa. So files are spread all around the app in this case. And cruft can easily remain in the code base, because when you want to delete one thing, you have to remember that that one feature, let's say the product page, might have some images associated with it, might have some JS associated with it, so you now have to grok around a bunch of different files to get rid of things. This was creating a huge problem for us. We were ending up with a lot of stale code in our code base. So this got me thinking about this idea of a component directory structure, which is not anything new. Nicholas Gallagher actually first spoke about it at CSSConf AU a couple years ago. And in this type of directory structure, what you do is that you group all the files and all the pieces of the component within a folder for the component. Instead of having images and everything in different areas, your component, in this case product, contains everything that it needs to instantiate itself. So if you need to delete it, you just delete one folder. So everything is in one place, which is super, super, super helpful, and you get an entire idea of what it takes. And we use this for organization in our we have a repo called Nightshade Core, which is really our patterns that make up our design system. And then we also use this in our actual app organization. We organize our views by this process. We've really extended it to everything, and it's working really, really well. And the cool thing about this is that when you pair it with a build tool, it really doesn't matter where things are anymore, because you just tell your build tool where to look. So in this case, we're saying we want to compile everything that's in our views to HTML, and we don't want it. We underscore our partials, so compile all of those. Here's another example for pre-compiling our templates. We want it to look for everything that has an HTML extension in our app directory, but also we have a core directory where we move a lot of our, as I mentioned, our entire design system patterns are in an external repo. And so we need our build tool to also search in there. And for browser sync, when we're watching, we just, again, tell it where to look. And so it's not that complicated anymore to logically group things in different ways. We don't have to continue following these sort of traditional structures that we've had. So these are some of the ways that we have been applying these patterns to all of our work. I'm very curious to see what people think about these, if they think that this could be helpful, depending on your team constraints. And if you have want to get into any more of these patterns and their use cases, please let me know. I will be putting up a repo that shares the ones that I had outlined earlier and how I've been thinking about them. So I'd love any feedback. Thank you.
Just some new, that was mind-blowing to me, that let's not, instead of keeping I have a CSS folder with all the CSS stuff in it. You're like, screw that, I'm going to do component level and just mix them all together. Literally the first time I've ever seen that.
It's working really, really, really well. And also for things like IE styles, because then, we have the one IE style sheet right now, which means that, again, when you remove a component, it keeps all its extra cruff in there, and it's getting really ugly. And now it's just have a little file partial for your IE styles, and then include that in your main manifest.
Do you bust it down by pattern or
per pattern? So pattern. Yeah, especially per pattern. When we're looking at our components, we believe that it should contain everything that defines it. So if it needs any IE overrides, that should be there. If it has any JS, that should be defined in that folder structure. You shouldn't have to go anywhere else to look for it.
Cool. So a pattern is like tabs or something. There's a folder for tabs, and there's tabs.html, or not even HTML, tabs.cool nunchucks.
.macros.html, yeah. That's our
.macros?
So macros is that's our naming convention, and we know that the file is a macro, and most of our patterns are all macros, so they don't.
And the word macro meaning it's executed or whatever with parameters.
Yeah, so macro is Nunchuck's term for mix-in, what SAS would call a mix-in, right?
Yeah. So okay.
A way of reusing passing in arguments and reusing code.
And then tabs.scss or whatever, or whatever you want.
So we've actually been doing, so there's a issue that hasn't been moved into Sass 4 yet, but I believe it will be, where Sass is going to abide by the same rules, kind of like a node module. So if you have an index.js in your node module, it knows that that's your entry point. So if you have an index.scss, the new Sass compiler will know that that is your entry point. So we've been making sure that our entry point is always index.scss for when that change happens.
There's a Sass 4?
Yes.
No, that's kind of cool. So it just knows. That's a convention I use typically anyways. That index means it's the master one. It's just going to require other stuff probably. And so you get some freebies from that. That's cool. And then so you'd be like tabs, and then you'd keep the IE styles and maybe a different even style sheet even in there, so that, I don't know, it's just not some like master of IE style sheets that relates to all your patterns. I mean,
yeah, little simple individual ones. So the actual IE style sheet that gets compiled is just a manifest that imports the different ones.
Yeah, cool. It seems like so it was, what did it go? It went global process workspace pattern. There's a lot.
Workspace project, yeah.
Project, right. And project meaning, I don't know, maybe you'd pick, accessibility was one in global, right? And that applies to all your projects. Is that kind of, is it trickle down in that way? Like you make a choice in the global level. At a project, you might, use a different preprocessor or something, but they all share like accessibility principles.
Yeah, the idea is that the global ones are kind of things that everyone could share if you decide to make it a priority, right? If your team decides to say, we are going to make accessibility a priority, then that becomes a pattern, and that pattern should trickle down to everything.
Yeah. Yeah, and it seems like it was, I like how there's like people choices in there mixed right in with code choices. So your open borders thing is like, that's just a thing that we chose that has kind of equal weight between, it's a choice just like how many tabs versus spaces you have is how thick the cubicle walls are.
Totally, how we sit. Yeah, I think more and more that, we make a lot of decisions in code, and we are technical people, but we work with other people, and so I've really become interested in sort of people and organization, and I think that those decisions carry equal weight as your code decisions, and making sure that those are sound will govern the end result of your project.
So many people have talked about naming in this thing. I mean, it's just, for sure, naming is hard. What's your kind of structure so far on naming? Do you have any like philosophies of it or anything of how you approached it?
Yeah, so because as we've been developing our pattern system, we want to make sure that the language that we're using is one that makes sense for everyone. So whenever we are like looking at a new design or about to codify patterns, I grab the designer and I grab some devs and we sit down and we're like, what do we want to call this thing? And we will have various of these meetings, and then we'll take those solutions and we'll share them with the rest of our team. So we have this like weekly jam session, and it's a time for us to sort of share what's been going on. And so we'll bring them up. We'll be like, what do you think of these? And naming for us goes down to even like what we call the properties in our macro. And so
no kidding, yeah.
Yeah, we want to make sure that like
naming
this makes
everything.
sense.
It's not just like what the folder is called, it's everything.
Everything, yeah. Like a consistent, is the parameter. One that we ran into was like, okay, do we use URL or do we use path? And then we decided URL and path are both different things semantically, and so we know that when we see URL in the parameter, we're expecting the full HTTP whatever URL, and if we see path, we're expecting a portion of that path. So really disambiguating and making it a priority. I mean, if you don't have sound names, you can't communicate with your team.
Right. It sounds like you're like pretty stoked on getting to a static world, where it's like the end result of all this is, preprocessors running and stuff, and what you get out of it is a static website, right?
Yeah, I am beginning to wonder if we really need to have our websites coupled to things these days anymore. I think that as long as you have a really nice API structure, backend structure, then you're fine.
Some of the advantages of it were that the setting it up was, you set up a new dev and you have them pull the project and you do npm install and they're good to go kind of thing. Right
there, yeah. Very, very simple, very easy. I mean, you don't have to deal
Was
with
there
the
a
constraints of the
discussion
product.
was anybody worried that, because it was like a Rails stack before or something, this is like inside baseball stuff, but like it was like, is anybody worried that like, well, that you can't ever have a login system then or something? It doesn't, is Casper like 90% like front end static stuff that doesn't need that anyway and they're not worried? Or?
So we're mostly, like if you look at our website, I would say the majority of our website is static, but we're going to have, we're actually going to be reading from a content API that will have that content API, and then we'll also have a data API. So for handling things like
So there's
login,
backend stuff. It's just API.
it's all going to be API driven. Yeah.
Cool. I want to see it.
You want to see it? Could live demo. We can show you after.
Cool. So a different set of dependencies for a new world. Best of luck, Claudina. Thanks.
Thanks.
That was awesome.